Chapter 3, Juropean or Middle Eastern. In the first chapter, we discussed the difference between the landed aristocracy and a hypothesized city-based aristocracy, with the general theme being that Jewishness emerges from within culture via the development of cities. However, this idea somewhat clashes with the general idea that the Jews in Europe arrived from elsewhere and originated in the Middle East. In this chapter, I'll explain why these two ideas aren't mutually exclusive and how the reality is probably something of an overlap between these two processes. We may start off with a simple premise. Cities are more genetically diverse than the surrounding countryside. So if we take a modern example, let's say England. Both the cities and the countryside are predominantly white native English. However, over time, immigrants arrive. These immigrants have a general tendency to settle in towns and cities, as that's where the major opportunities are. As more time passes, integration occurs to varying degrees, with native white people settling down and having children with the immigrant populations, eventually leading to these immigrant populations blending into the wider population. As a consequence, assuming the immigration isn't overwhelming, the towns and cities will remain predominantly white English. However, they will be slightly less so than the lesser mixed people in the countryside. Now, this is something of an oversimplification, of course. It's also perhaps a slightly poor example, given how quickly the demographics of England are currently changing. So forgive me if you're reading this at some point in the future, and the idea of a predominantly white England seems a little passé. The point is a useful one, though, and highlights how cities can have a much more international makeup than the wider country they belong to. You only need to look at places such as London and New York and then compare the makeup of those cities to leafier or more rural parts of southern England or East Coast America. If we follow the hypothesis that Jewish people are, or were, effectively a city-based class of some description, then we may surmise that they'll be especially influenced by this cultural and ethnic mixing that takes place in cities. Trade links develop between cities, and cultural links develop between the traders and financiers conducting this trade. This, in turn, may lead to intermarriages between families. As a consequence of arranged marriages for economic and social reasons, or simply as a consequence of personal relationships developing naturally. A trader may travel to another town or city to do business and then meet the daughter or sister of another trader, for instance, leading to marriage and perhaps children. Over time, this process may lead to, say, English trading families living in England having a slightly more diverse genetic makeup than the average English family, due to the marriages and family ties that have developed with other trading families in other cities and towns, perhaps even towns and cities in much more far-flung places. Of course, to all intents and purposes, they'll still look largely indistinguishable from most other English families. However, over time it's possible that small, noticeable differences may accrue. In fact, we can see a similar thing with the traditional landed aristocracy. For example, the wealthy English upper classes look to all intents and purposes like the rest of the English population. However, there are some slight noticeable differences that people will often make reference to, either consciously or subconsciously, such as the fact that aristocratic people tend to be taller than their poorer compatriots. People also often allude to the fact that aristocratic people tend to look a bit horsey. This idea that the landed aristocracy look horsey in some way is a little bit silly, and it's a hard thing to quantify in any reasonable sort of way. However, it's something we all intuitively understand, even if it's just as a vague generalization. We kind of understand what people mean when they point out this caricatured horsiness. So, are these slight almost imperceptible differences, a consequence of the intermarriages between European aristocrats over the centuries and their relative separation from the lower classes of society? Or perhaps are they a consequence of the differing lifestyles these people have led over successive generations in comparison to the rest of the population? Or are they just figments of our imagination, the result of our cultural stereotypes and prejudices? It's difficult to tell, yet we carry these stereotypes and prejudices nonetheless. I would suggest that a similar process is perhaps partly responsible for the slight differences that are noted between Jews and the wider non-Jewish populations they often find themselves amongst. The Middle Eastern features of European Jews could be due to the trade links and consequent marital links reaching across Europe and into the Middle East, leading to a gene flow across the continents. Likewise, some of the other Jewish stereotypes could be in part due to successive generations of Jews living in urban or city conditions, such as the stereotype that Jewish people are less inclined to physical activity and more suited to academic and legal pursuits. Of course, city living and city professions tend to require lots of time indoors as opposed to agriculture and other countryside pursuits, so perhaps centuries of exposure to such lifestyles could lead to a natural predisposition towards those type of things, or at the very least, a cultural bias towards such living. The wearing of glasses and the high levels of literacy in Jewish societies are other stereotypes that could be similarly explained. In fact, this literacy aspect is something I'll be returning to in later chapters. Now, the above are all quite crude stereotypes, of course, vague generalizations that may simply disappear under closer inspection. However, the stereotypes, like the ones regarding the landed aristocracy mentioned earlier, are all ones we can easily recognize. So perhaps there are some grains of truth underpinning them, though whether these grains be genetic or purely cultural is once again hard to tell. Either way, the stereotypes require an explanation, even if they're wrong, and the explanation that they're a product of urban living is quite a rational one in many ways. So, to summarize this brief chapter and to answer the question its title poses, I would propose that European Jews are both Middle Eastern and European, though I would lean towards the idea that they are predominantly European, particularly with regard to the Jewish communities we see mentioned in medieval texts. A product of city living and the trade links and people flow between trading towns and cities, trade links perhaps reaching from Europe to as far as the Middle East and maybe even beyond. As for the commonly accepted version of history and its view that there have been mass Jewish migrations into Europe from the Middle East, I would also consider this as a possible part of the explanation too, though I would argue that this possible migration of people, ideas, and perhaps also religions is a consequence of a huge economic shift that is much overlooked. An economic shift that will require something of a revision to the commonly accepted historic timeline if its importance is to be appreciated and understood. All will be elucidated in the next chapter.